down even more basic. It's gross, right? Okay? So it's gross. We know that it's damaging. We know that it causes health problems. We know that it could make or break a deal sometimes on a home. It could ruin people's living arrangements. It can be costly. So what we do know right off the bat is that mold is a serious problem. And so what we want to do today is we want to expand on, of course it's a serious problem, but why is it such? And what can we do? What are some steps that we can take in order to remediate or remove the problem from our lives and from the lives of people that we serve and are in contact with? So mold is, it belongs to the fungus family, and it's very complex. Because fungi are the #1 degraders of cellulose on the planet, it's easy to see why it's such a problem. There are over 200 species of fungi that exist, and we commonly encounter on a regular basis. Mold is one of them. We have all breathed in mold spores. I don't want everyone to get all freaked out about that. It's just a reality. Now the thing is that sometimes the mold spores or the amount of mold can be at a high level where it becomes damaging. But we all inhale it, we all breathe it in, and it's around us regularly. There are some things that we need to learn about mold right off the bat. One is that it requires a food source. It requires a source that it can breed on. And for most of us, we see mold on drywall, in food, in carpets, fabrics. Another thing that we need to know about mold is that it requires a specific temperature. So, levels of high humidity, levels where it's damp, and that brings us to the next point, which, water. Without water, there can be no mold. So we find that in areas where it's particularly moist, or where there's been leaks, or where there's just a high concentration of water floating around, you have the prime breeding grounds for mold. The interesting thing about mold is that it's a microscopic organism. Sure, we can see it on the surface, and I think we have all seen it in a loaf of bread, for example. That disgusting kind of green spot. But what we don't know is that every single little tiny membrane inside of that mold spot contains thousands and thousands of microscopic parts. One of the interesting parts is the mold spores. Now, the best way that I like to describe mold spores is I want everyone in the room to picture a tree, right? And we'll go right into the Gatineau Hills during fall, where it's beautiful and the leaves are changing color, and the leaves are starting to fall off at the slightest brisk wind. Now, the thing is that we know about trees is that they all have roots, and then the roots underneath the soil, that's what drives the tree into growth and into fruition. Am I correct? Now that's exactly what a mold spore would look like, or what mold looks like, is that you have the trunk, and then you have the beautiful leaves on top. The leaves are what we would call mold spores. Now what happens is that when a wind brushes through a tree during the fall, all the leaves start to fall off, and they scatter across our lawn and make it difficult for us to rake all the time. That's the same thing with mold spores. Is that mold spores are the parts that get brushed off the actual part of the tree and get flown around the atmosphere, float around in the air. And that's the part that becomes damaging. Now the interesting thing is that when we're dealing with mold and how to remove it, we can't just cut off the trunk of the tree. We have to get down to the roots. One of the household remedies that my mother used to use for spots that were mold-like was bleach, Javex. Just pour it right on top, wiped right off, and it didn't return for a couple months. But that's because we didn't get at the root. So, cleaning the surface off is never going to do it. An interesting thing about mold spores, and this is one of the things that we found, is that mold spores are very allergenic, especially to people who are allergic to shellfish. Can I ask, just out of curiosity, who here is allergic to shellfish? Now the reason why is that the actual microscopic organism, the actual mold spore, looks like a lobster. I know it sounds kind of weird, but it looks like a lobster. It has a very hard shell and a very soft interior. So that makes it also very resistant to certain things, which is why mold is such a problem. It's so hard to remove. So we find that people who are, for example, allergic to shellfish will be additionally or more susceptible to allergic reactions brought on by mold or the presence of mold in homes. why water is so important with mold is that it becomes its germination source. So mold spores, when it gets brushed off into the atmosphere, for example, we have a section of a wall that's contaminated with, let's just say, this much mold, which doesn't seem like a lot, am I correct? But when a person, let's just say, would walk by this piece of wall that has mold, and the wind carries off those mold spores go off into the surrounding area of the house, and then it will land, let's just say, in a small puddle of water or a level of moisture on a piece of drywall. Immediately, once the mold spore gets into contact with that moisture, it starts to germinate, it starts to reproduce right away. Now, I know this sounds like scary science fiction stuff, but it really is what we're dealing with, is that mold grows upon contact with water. Just before we started the presentation, Lee was sharing about how there was, in the news recently, a woman who was found with mold growing in her lungs. I don't know if you guys have read about that. And that's as a result of being in an environment here in town that was contaminated. And that not at all surprised me one bit, because our body is filled with water, which makes this problem with mold so dangerous, especially with people who are immunocompromised, or children or the elderly whose systems cannot properly fight off some of those attacks. So one of the things we always want to know, people want to know, well, I can't see the mold. It's not on the wall, it's not visible. Is it still there? Absolutely. Right? We can find mold under carpets, behind walls. We could find it in places that we just would not even think about. We find mold naturally in furniture. We find them in wood, wallpaper, food, soil, a number of different things. One of the things that I remember a presentation about a year ago that we had done, we had started talking about mold growing in fabric. And there was a person in the audience who had a really hard time with that. He was like, oh no, that's impossible. If the clothes is dry, how can there possibly be any mold that grows onto it? Well, that was the problem. Her first assumption was that the fabric was dry. So I brought an example. How many people here are car fans? Car fans, yeah. You like cars, you like the sound of a nice engine. Well, there's this beautiful car in Toronto that got a car wash, interiorly washed, perfectly done. It was a nice Porsche Boxer, and it was beautiful. It's a beautiful car. But it was wintertime, so they washed it from top to bottom, outside, inside, and then the owner put it into storage. Guess what? I don't know if you can see that properly, but all this green stuff, that's all mold growing on the inside of that car.
Oh my God.
Because it wasn't dried out. And so we had the prime ground for mold. We had moisture. It was locked in storage, so we had humidity. There was no light. We had darkness, which fungus grows and thrives in the darkness. So we had the prime breeding grounds for mold. Now this poor gentleman, when he came to pull out his car in the springtime, this is what he found in his car. Completely saturated. And not only on the fabric, as we see here, kind of on the leather, and that's also the stick shift as well. And so the plastic that it started to grow onto, it started to, especially since it was locked away for 3 months, it had nothing else better to do. So it just started to reproduce and grow all over. Isn't that nasty or what? So mold grows in a number of different areas, places that we would least expect it, which is why, this is what we try to do, is try to raise as much awareness as possible about mold, because it could affect us when we least expect it. Why is mold such a problem? Well, naturally, it causes structural damage, which in fact, causes time, costs money, and it's also very time consuming. For example, my younger brother went to go buy a home, and everything was fine. The home inspector did his rounds, everything was great, except in the basement, they had discovered afterwards that there was mold. Not on the wall, but there was, I guess, like barnwood, I don't know the best way to describe it, all around the bottom of the basement. And there was nothing on the exterior. The air quality tests seemed to be okay, but behind that, growing on the concrete or the whatever that surface was mold all along the bottom. And so It was a lengthy process. You had to sandblast all the walls around. It cost my brother a whole bunch of money to get this fixed. And it really started to bring things into perspective for me personally, that this is a very serious problem, and it could cost us a lot more than we would think, especially when it comes to our health. People, like I said earlier, who are allergic to shellfish, for example, they are more susceptible to some of the very dangerous consequences that mold can bring. But it also causes other problems on a regular basis, respiratory issues, flu-like symptoms. In fact, earlier this week, Andre and I, we went to a place in Montreal to do an assessment on a home where an elderly woman, whenever she would sleep in her bedroom, would get violently sick. And there was no idea what was going on, no idea what the problem was. She would be removed from that home or her apartment, brought to her daughter's place, and she was fine. Her health resumed normal. The doctors were kind of stumped. Well, what do you guys think the problem was? Her mattress. Yeah, she wasn't sleeping right. No, but it's true. There was something in the atmosphere, something in the air that she was breathing in that was causing some respiratory issues. So we're doing the assessment right now, and we're pretty certain we know what we're going to find. Did you know that marijuana grow-ops leave homes structurally devastated and overrun with mold? Repairs can be very costly. How many people here have dealt directly with a marijuana grow-op home? My first experience prior to being involved with Mold Busters, I was a counselor in a residential drug and alcohol treatment program for 10 years. And one of the things I had to do was take clients to go pick up their property every once in a while. So one time, I brought this guy over to his pad, if you will, to go grab his stuff. We walked in, and that was my first encounter with a marijuana grow-op home. That was completely, the walls were black from one end to the other. And they were originally white. There was no paint jobs done or anything. It was just completely saturated with mold. Because again, those prime breeding grounds, right? You have high levels of humidity, moisture on a regular basis. It's not clean. And as we know, trying to resell a home that was previously a marijuana grow-op can be very, very tricky. So common sources of mold problems in homes that, on a regular basis that we would find, part of it leaks in pipes and roofs. What's the interesting thing about a leak in a pipe? So a lot of times we don't see it. It's behind a wall. So how do we know that there's a little bit of a drip going on in the wall and dripping onto the insulation and onto the drywall?
We don't know.
We don't know, right? That's why we need to do air quality tests on a regular basis to determine what the air particle count is in the air, what exactly is floating around in there. Cracks in walls and foundations. Flooding or other forms of water intrusion. For example, windowsills is a common area, am I right? Window the water leaks in on the windowsill and kind of builds up. We wipe it off, and over a period of time, we start seeing that the entire wood starts to crack. And then what we start finding is little black spots popping up all over the place. A common issue. Inadequate ventilation, that's another important one as well. And we're not talking about having a fan, we're talking about having a proper air filtration system into our homes or into our offices. For example, if we were to go back to the Porsche Roadster earlier, we would see that there was no ventilation in the storage unit. The car was locked in, windows rolled up, and again, it was one of the contributing factors that led to its spread across the entire vehicle. Now, when people ask us about mold and ask us to help them with removing mold, they always want a quick answer. Okay, well, how much is it going to cost? How much time is it going to take to remove it? And we always have to tell them, listen, it's never that simple. And the reason is because there are many different types of mold. Right? Like we mentioned at the beginning, it's a very complex microscopic organism that we're dealing with. And one of the things that we need to do is ascertain exactly what type of mold we're dealing with, its concentration, where it's at, and so on and so forth. Now, there are 4 primary forms of mold that we would deal with. One is called a hydrophilic type of mold. And this is where there's lots of water, so typically in flooding areas, usually found in bathrooms or basements, and in bathrooms around the